Good morning, everybody. How's the audio? Okay. Okay, so once again, my name is Nima. I'm going to be taking us into the break with a very general overview of the specialized searches. And then on the other side of the break, Carrie and I will return to actually start to do some example queries where we will, do screenshots of how you can use these fields, in application. So as you've heard this morning, we have quite an abundance of fields that we capture or that we can capture in the database, in excess of 300. So what the specialized searches and the detail searches in particular allow you to do is to essentially formulate queries that will access each and every one of those fields. So collectively, the specialized searches entail 4 detail searches, which are listed here, beginning with epitope, T-cell, B-cell, and MHC assay details. And then there's an identifier search, which I'll talk about at the end. But in essence, these are, as Carrie had mentioned, your opportunity to drill down to individual field level and ask very specific questions. Now, I want to emphasize that, as Bjorn had mentioned at the outset, one of our primary efforts with the redesign of 3.0 was to make a homepage interface that we thought would address the majority of sort of everyday queries that people perform. And we've validated that we've accomplished that by sort of interaction with our user groups. So we definitely don't want to discourage you from using the specialized searches, but I want to reemphasize that most of the time you'll probably find yourself being fine with using the homepage search that Carrie has described. But nevertheless, these specialized searches are there and they are very empowering, so I will run through them briefly for you. So they're accessible from the homepage specialized searches menu, and you can see there's a drop down there. And if you were to, for instance, select the Epitope Details, the first one, what you will be shown is essentially this page. So first thing I want to emphasize here is that while this looks very similar to the page or pages that Carrie was describing, it is actually slightly different. Primarily on the left-hand side here, where you have these search fields. If you'll notice, you have actually much more data fields there, but they're not immediately evident. They're sort of hidden or buried underneath these plus signs. But starting with the broad sort of groupings, under the epitope details search, you'll have 2 groupings called the epitope fields and the reference fields. So what this essentially affords you to do is ask very specific questions about the epitope structure and or the reference from which that epitope was derived or described. So if, for example, you were to mouse over the epitope-related fields, you'll see that you can click these plus signs and actually reveal the extent of the fields. And in this case, what I've done is just basically revealed some of the fields related to the epitope structure itself to show that, sure, you can search by the fields that Carrie has described. Those are still there, so by source of the epitope, whether it be an antigen or an organism. But now you see a whole host of other fields ranging from the name of the epitope that the authors may have given or the curator may have given, which may be marginally useful, start and stop positions. And so these may not be frequently used, but nevertheless they're there. We kind of take pride as curators in capturing a lot of this data. So one that might be more useful to you would be what we call the epitope related object fields down below, which is not expanded at the moment, but this enables you to perform a search for analogs and or mimetopes. So of course, very often the epitope that we capture is, for example, not a naturally occurring molecule. It's not found in any natural source or organism. It could be some sort of analog made by amino acid substitutions, or a mimetope that's panned from some sort of artificial source like a phage display library. Nevertheless, because those aren't tied to a source, if one strictly performed an epitope search by a naturally occurring antigen and or organism, you may not encounter that data. However, it may be of interest to you. So what these fields afford is the ability to do searches for things that might be analogs and or mimetopes of naturally occurring molecules or organisms that you are interested in. And so we can, again, look at those in specific queries later if you'd like. Down below, so this is the same screen, but now we've shifted the attention from the epitope-related fields down to the reference-related fields. And essentially the same idea. There are just richer context, a richer amount of fields, more in depth. For instance, one can perform, as Carrie mentioned, a search by authors, author names. But as you've heard, we capture data from a variety of sources, those that are submitted, those that are from references that are published or manuscripts that are published. If you choose, for example, to focus on one of those two, you can specify that here in the reference section by, for instance, choosing I'm only interested in journal article information or submissions exclusively. Okay, so if we move on now, there are three other detail searches, and those were the remaining assay, sort of the big three assay broad categories that we captured, those being T, B, and MHC. So I've kind of lumped those into one slide because by and large they overlap in the fields that you see, although each link takes you to its separate page. And beginning over here, you can see that sort of cut off at the top and the bottom are the end of the epitope fields that we just looked at and the beginning of the reference fields that we just looked at. So those are conserved from the same epitope search, detail search that we just looked at, and they're available as before. However, you have now two additional sections, one called host and one called assay, which really gets into the nitty-gritty of the individual data fields that we capture. So I've just sort of highlighted some of the powers that you're given here in terms of formulating specific queries. So for example, if you wanted to, in the host section, we collect under these headings called in vivo process and first immunogen, collectively the fields that describe the state of the host, how the immune reactivity was acquired. For example, was it an infection? Was it an immunization? What the disease history, if any, of the host is. Those are all hidden under these fields, and you can open those to expand and delineate those, and we'll do those in some of the sample queries later. Similarly, down below in the assay, these are the fields that enable you to sort of specify, for example, effector cell phenotypes, antibody isotypes, things that, again, are not available on the home page search, because, again, that's a very streamlined, boiled down version of what we think are the kind of the major inlet to the database. But certainly these are very useful for many purposes. So to give you kind of a broad example of what you could use this page for is if you were, for instance, interested in only epitopes that were described in the context of a host being infected and then the assay being read out with a peptide, an epitope. You could specify in the host section that I want only natural infections followed by a specific assay type where the assay antigen is epitope. Or conversely, you could say, I want to know where were the cases where the host was, for example, peptide immunized, but the reactivity was to whole organism. So you could say immunogen equals epitope, antigen equals organism, etc. So as I mentioned, I will I will be going into those fields a little bit more detail as we go through the example queries and live queries later. So the last menu item on the specialized search menu is the identifier search. And this essentially opens up a pop-up window where you're given a series of fields or identifier input fields. And they're kind of broken up into essentially two sections. We have a cluster of fields that we call internal or IEDB related identifiers. These are identifiers that we give to the data as we include them into the database. So every epitope that's either curated or submitted is assigned an epitope ID. So for example, if you have your favorite epitope and you want to share it with somebody or revisit that data, one of the quickest ways to get at it is to just enter the epitope ID there. But more commonly, these pages are used with external identifiers, and those are the unique identifiers of the data resources that you've heard about this morning that we integrate with. So for example, PubMed, every single literature manuscript that we curate has a PubMed ID. So you could, for instance, whether you were aware or not that that data was in our database, you could certainly search for it if you had the PubMed ID by starting here. So just a quick view of what that might look like. If you were to put a PubMed ID there and hit search, you would be immediately taken to the data summary that you're now familiar with the tabs that basically summarize all the data in kind of a succinct view. And then from there, you could navigate through and look at the specific data from that paper, for example.